As I walked through the wilderness of this world, I lighted on a certain place where was a den, and I laid me down in that place to sleep. And as I slept, I dreamed a dream. I dreamed, and behold, I saw a man clothed with rags standing in a certain place, with his face from his own house and a book in his hand, and a great burden on his back. I looked and I saw him open the book and read therein. And as he read, he wept and trembled, and not being able any longer to contain, he brake out with a lamentable cry, saying, "What shall I do?" Now, this is the beginning of the Pilgrim's Progress. And John Bunyan, his representation of Christian, making his way from this world, the city of destruction, to the celestial city. And it's really, it's John Bunyan's search for answers on this path that would lead him through the overwhelming challenges and changes in his own life. So, as we start this series, this introduction today is really going to focus in on John Bunyan, the life of John Bunyan in a very quick introduction. And the reason it's so important to understand the life of Bunyan is because his life and the Pilgrim's Progress are intertwined. The Pilgrim's Progress is really an allegory in a way of John Bunyan's own life, this first part of the Pilgrim's Progress. So let's start. And our story starts with John Bunyan in 1682 in Elstow, the small English farming village to the north of London in Bedfordshire. Now, John was the eldest of the family. He had a sister and a younger brother, and his father was what is known as a tinker. And a tinker in England in those days would be somebody who had an anvil. He had a hammer and a chisel, and he would go and he would mend pots. He would mend pans. He would go out and do anything that had to do with metal, fixing metal. And, they would call him, another thing to call him is like a tinsmith. And he worked with these metals, and he was very good at it. And he taught his son John how to do it, and John became very good at it, to the point that in the Bunyan Museum in Bedford, England, there is a display of a tin violin that Bunyan made. Now, from the age of about 9, we find out that John Bunyan's probably a lot like us, and that is he became quite this little troublemaker, all right? He found that he could swear a lot. In fact, he made really good use of foul language, and he really regretted this as time went on and his life went on. But it got so bad, as the story goes, that this owner in the village of the sweet shop, who was known herself to be a very foul-languaged lady, reprimanded John for his language, all right? And John thought to himself, my goodness, if the lady who curses like a sailor is telling me that I'm swearing too much, I might have a problem, and I might be pretty wrong. And we're going to quote a lot tonight from Bunyan's autobiography called "The Grace Abound in the Chief of Sinners." And John talks about this age, this time period. And he said of himself, being so filled with all unrighteousness in my life, that from a child I had no equal for cursing, swearing, lying, and blaspheming the holy name of God. Yea, so settled and rooted was it in these things that they became as second nature to me. Now, John writes that at the age of about 9 to 10, he used to wake up with nightmares, with terrible nightmares, many of them having to do with death. And this bothered him for many, many years. And this had an effect on him in his conversion. And we find out later that, in his life that he had a very sensitive conscience. He was well aware that his behavior, his antics were wrong. And as a boy, he developed this strong fear about his sin, this burden of his sin. And he felt that he was not in good standing with God, and it was a sure thing that God's judgment would fall upon him. And these thoughts, these echoes will come out as we go through the Pilgrim's Progress of John's own sort of journey from salvation, from sort of not knowing God to salvation, this burden of sin to the joy of being reconciled with God. Now he goes on to write about these things. He says, "These things I said when I was but a child, but 9 or 10 years old, so distressed my soul, that then in the midst of my many sports and childish vanities, amidst my vain companions, I was often much cast down and afflicted in my mind therewith, yet I could not let go of my sin." And, John was aware of his weaknesses. At the same time, he felt that he was unable to control them. Now, he had a disrespect, again, a little kid, teenage kid, 12 years old, whatever it might be, but he had this disrespect, this disobedience to his father that caused a real strain on their relationship. And during the time that he grew up, around the time that he was about 15 years old, his mother died. And within a few weeks of his mother dying, his sister dies. And John, obviously, as a 15-year-old, was very distressed, very sad, had this feeling of being alone. But then what happened was John's father, within weeks of losing their mother, Thomas, his father, remarries. And it just pushed John over the edge. Pushed him over the edge to the point that he was trying to figure out how he could leave home at this age of 15. Now, let's put John Bunyan in his story off to the side for a little bit and talk about the things that were going on in England at the time, because this was a very time of turmoil in the nation of England, and we're about to lead into a civil war. So King Charles I was the monarch at the time, and he believed in the divine right of kings. And this means that he believed God appointed kings. That's a good thing. We agree with that God basically anoints our leaders. But he got it wrong a little bit, because he thought that since God anointed kings, that kings were like God. And that meant that kings were never wrong. And this belief of that everything he said was right and he could not be wrong led to this conflict with Parliament, because Parliament, the governing body of the people, sort of like our Congress, our House of Representatives, he expected them to do exactly what he said without question, because he was right. And basically, this time period came to sort of a head a little bit, the first head, I guess you could say, in 1629, when the members of Parliament were caught by surprise a little bit when they went to go into the Westminster Abbey, which was where they met. And basically, they found that the doors were chained by King Charles. And basically, Charles chained the doors, locked the doors, and they would remain locked for 11 years. And this was known by the members of Parliament as the 11 years of tyranny. So put this into perspective. This would be like the President of the United States walking down the mall and going up to the Congress and having all the doors chained, not allowing any member of Congress to go in for 11 years. Some of us would probably like that, but that's sort of what it equates to. Now, King Charles, really continued to alienate himself from the nation and from the people. He raised taxes, and part of his kingdom was Scotland. And basically with the Scots, he forced a new prayer book on them. And these prayer books were run by the government, and that was the only thing that these churches could use in their worship service. Now, the Scots got so angry with the king's sort of intrusion on their religious services that they invaded England in 1639. Now, Charles was unable to raise a strong army, and really it came to be that he was forced to agree not to interfere with the religion of the Scots. And the big thing was he was ordered, he had to agree with Scotland that he would pay these war expenses, the war retribution. And that forced Charles to basically open up Parliament again, because only Parliament could raise the money to pay the Scots off for this war. So he reluctantly reconvened Parliament, and a show of their power, as soon as Parliament reconvened, they passed a law, a decree, that the king could never abolish Parliament again. And then they also, raised their own taxes. And there started to be a little bit of an age of cooperation between Parliament and the king. It didn't last long, because in 1642, in a show of his authority, King Charles, sent 300 soldiers to Parliament to arrest five of their leaders, which were his opponents. Now, the men that he was going to arrest were tipped off, so they fled, and this attempted sort of coup of these Parliament leaders really backfired on Charles, to the point that in 6 days after this action, civil war broke out between the Parliament on one side, called the Parliamentarians, and the monarchy, Charles I. Now, the Parliamentarians were run by a guy named Oliver Cromwell. You probably remember this if you remember your history at all. And he was the president of the Parliament, and he was the leader of the Parliamentarians. And he was against the king, obviously, and he was going about the countryside at this time looking for recruits for his new army to fight the monarchy. And it just happened to be that he was in Bedfordshire looking for these recruits. And we get back to John Bunyan. John Bunyan made himself at the age of 15 look like a 16-year-old. That wouldn't have taken much. And he basically wanted to enlist in Cromwell's army, and he did. And they took him. They needed soldiers. They needed anybody that was willing to fight. So here we go, John Bunyan off to war, going to fight a war. And he really has no clue what he's getting into. I mean, he left home because he was angry. He left home because he felt he was being restricted by his father. He went and he joined the army. And really, this was a tough war. All civil wars are tough wars. And there was little comfort. There was little rations. The reality of battle must have shook him tremendously, because life in the army in those days would have been very, very hard. John would have grown up really quickly because he enters this time of civil war. He enters the army on the Parliamentarian side, and they had little funding. Many of these soldiers weren't even issued uniforms; they're just thrown in, and soldiers weren't paid much, very little. Rations were meager at best. Usually they only had bread, cheese, and water as their diet. These men would be forced to go out into the countryside and basically steal anything they could get for provisions. And some of these men basically deserted. And that's a big deal because desertion, the penalty of desertion was basically death, so firing squad. So, and the life was horrible. It was horrible. It was just terrible. And, you're issued a rifle, you're issued a musket. And this musket in those days, if you can think back to our Civil War and then go back to our Revolutionary War and then go even 100 years earlier than that, they're musket fire where, they basically put a ball in, powder in, shoot, and then have to reload the whole thing again. And during this reloading process, they're sitting ducks, basically, to get shot. So this wasn't the freedom. This wasn't the freedom that Bunyan was looking for when he went off to war and really ran away from home. Now, these folks, they went into battle, and we get this story that was sort of one of these pivoting moments in Bunyan's life, where his regiment is getting ready to go off to battle. And just before the battle that John's unit is getting ready to go out to, one of the other soldiers that was with John wanted to take his place. And John's like, sure, fine, you want to go. And so they swapped the shift, is what they called it. And John gave up his duty to this other soldier, and he stayed behind. Now later, John's going to get a report that this other soldier died in battle, got shot in the head in battle. And when we hear about this, it was an effect. It was a moment in John's life. And according to his autobiography, this singular experience left him a lasting impression on him. Now, he had been spared death, we're told, 2 other times. So this would be the 3rd time that he was spared death. And the first time, I guess, he was holding a snake and he tried to take out the fangs of the snake. That was a very smart thing to do with a poisonous snake. The other time, he was swimming out to a boat and almost drowned as a child. And this 3rd time, basically, it was a wake-up call to John that there was a greater purpose for his life, that he was being saved providentially from death for this providential reason. And he had no idea what it was. And it haunted him a little bit. But it didn't change him. Like he had this feeling of providence on his life, that there was something more to his life, that God wanted more from him and was saving him from these death experiences. And it didn't change him. It didn't change at all. And then this reminds me so much of George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, who both thought that providence was on them. Both Abraham Lincoln and Washington talk about this feeling of God's presence, this feeling of providence, that they were meant for something. But again, we learn that John, it didn't change him because of this experience. He writes in his autobiography, "Here, as I said, were judgments and mercies, but neither of them did awake my soul to righteousness. Therefore, I sinned still and grew more and more rebellious against God and careless of my own salvation." So even though he felt this providential sort of purpose on his life, he didn't do anything about it. Now, after the war, this more seasoned, experienced, grown-up, mature John Bunyan returns to Elstow, and he reconciles with his father, and he takes up his trade as a tinkerer. And later we learn that, it wasn't long after he returned that he married his first wife. So John's maturing, all right? And these are all good things. So let's set John and his new wife over here for just a second and, sort of catch up a little bit about what's going on in England. Now, some of these events we need to know. In 1645, the Parliament took over the monarchy and the Church of England. This is what sparked that civil war. Now, the Church of England at the time was Anglican, and basically the parliamentarians switched over this Church of England, this Anglican church, and substituted it for Presbyterianism, okay? And what do? What do these good people do? They execute the Archbishop of the church. Now, in 1649, King Charles I, his forces lose to the parliamentarians, and Cromwell takes control. And basically, what happens is Charles I is beheaded, and the parliamentarians rule the nation of England from 1649 to 1660. There was no monarchy at that point. So there was no king at that point until Charles II comes along in 1660. So now back to Bunyan. So we remember when we left Bunyan, it was 1649. He had just gotten married. And in 1650, the joy of his first child being born. This child named Mary, this little girl named Mary, who's very, very dear to John's heart. But it's overshadowed by the fact that Mary is born blind. Now, John loved Mary, loved her dearly. In fact, he called her my dear little Mary. And we're going to learn more about Mary as we get to John's later life when he's in jail. So Bunyan now, he's a man. He's a family man. He's got a family. And this loneliness part of him seems to be, filled, being complete. But these former fears of death and this distance for God was still very, very much present in his life. And he still had many, many questions. Questions about his purpose, questions about God. And it was during this time of his marriage that John's life slowly began to change. And the reason was his first wife. And she, we learn, is a very religious person. She came from a very religious family. And at their wedding, her father gives the couple two very religious books, Puritan books. Now, they were about Christian living, and they had an impact on John's life. Now, we know what these books are. Lewis Bailey's Practice of Piety, and Arthur Dent's Plain Man's Pathway to Heaven. And John's wife would read these books to the family. And as they're going through and they're reading these books and they're reading the Bible, this weight of guilt, this guilt complex continued to come to John's heart. And it definitely was it started to transform him. But we also know that they were going to church at the local little parish church there in their village, and these sermons that they would hear had an impact. And you got to imagine yourself in this old time church, you know what I mean? This old time little church, and the preacher's up there, and he's banging on the pulpit, and he's almost yelling at you, he's spitting out at you, and it's hell and brimstone, fire and brimstone, all that kind of preaching, that old time good preaching. And the voice would reverberate off the walls, okay? And John, talks about he had no other choice but to listen, and no other choice but for that message to get in. You could not fall asleep and have your mind wander when somebody was preaching like that with such passion. And we know that on one particular day, and listen, this is a very important part of it. One particular day, he went to morning service, and the vicar whose name was Christopher Hall, gave a sermon about breaking the Sabbath, doing things that you shouldn't do on the Sabbath, on a Sunday. And it had an effect on John. John went home, and he says he went home, was head lowered, just under conviction of the sin of the Sabbath day. And his wife makes a lovely meal for him, lovely meal. And as he's going through the meal, he completely and utterly forgets about the sermon that had so convicted him, to the point that he went out and did what he did every Sunday, which was break the Sabbath. He went to the village green, and he met with some of his friends, and they started playing this game. And this game was called Tin Cat. And see if it sounds familiar. Hint, it's going to sound very much like cricket. In the game, you would throw up a piece of wood, and then the person had a stick, and he would take this stick, sort of like a bat, and try to swing at this piece of wood called the cat, and he would try to hit it as far as he could. All right? That's what's going on. So they're playing this game, and it's John's turn at bat, and the balls, the piece of wood is being thrown up in the air, and he's getting his bat, and he's almost ready to swing, and all of a sudden he hears this voice from heaven. He hears this voice from heaven come down to him, and this voice says, "Will thou leave thy sin and go to heaven, or have thy sins and go to hell?" Whoa! Okay, so this would have an effect on your life. If you get this voice from heaven saying, are you going to leave your sin or not? And it's very reminiscent of Paul on the road to Damascus, where he hears the voice of Jesus come down to him. And just like when Paul heard this, the people around John did not hear it, or at least did not hear the words, all right? And so Bunyan's greatly affected by this. That's a real duh statement. Of course he's affected by it. And he began, to change his ways. And I want you to listen very, very closely to this, because everything that John did is total work-based. It's total law-based, okay? He gave up, some of his favorite pastimes, and he was trying to please God. He was also trying to use his own conscience, but he was putting all this effort into it, all this effort into becoming religious, all right? But he wasn't feeling this inner peace. He was failing miserably. And it continued to plague him, this fear of failing God and the wrath of impending judgment from God's displeasure in his life. And so we get this story where John is a bell ringer, all right? And we don't know how long he was a bell ringer, but the bell ringers would go and they would ring the bell at a certain time. And, in his autobiography, he tells about this time when a fear came over him, like a phobia, that he felt the bell would fall onto him and crush him. So he keeps telling himself, okay, trying to reason with himself, what I'll do is instead of standing under the bell and ringing, and pull the rope and ring the bell, I'll stand under this beam, the big beam of the belfry, and I'll pull and ring the bell from there, because then if the bell falls, it'll hit the beam and it won't fall on me. But then he's like, well, wait a second. The bell's going to fall and it's going to hit the beam and it's going to crack the beam, and now the bell and the beam are going to fall on me. So instead of ringing the bell from the rope under the beam and under the bell and then under the beam, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ring it from the doorway of the belfry. So he puts this extra long rope on the bell, and he goes to the doorway of the belfry, and he's ringing the bell, and then all of a sudden he's thinking to himself, wait a second, I'm going to ring the bell, and it's going to shake the foundation so much that the bell's going to fall, and the whole belfry's going to fall, and everything's going to fall on top of me. This is the kind of fear that he had in his heart. So what does he do? He quits being a bell ringer. That's what he does. He gives up being a bell ringer altogether because of this phobia, this fear that the bell's going to fall on him. And Bunyan was truly, pun intended, at the end of his rope. All right? He could think of no other person in his village that was trying to please God as much as he was, yet it seemed to bring him no peace, and it was getting him nowhere. So we go to this time where he's walking through Bedford, and he sees this group of women that, you think of it as a Starbucks. They're sitting out, and you're walking into the Starbucks, and these guys are sitting there, these women, and they're talking about God. They're talking about Jesus. And Bunyan's thinking to himself, I am very religious. And he's sort of nosy because he's listening into him, and he's like, I'm very religious. I can get in on this conversation. So he starts to get in on this conversation, and he joins this conversation, and he's listening to these women talk. And he's listening and hearing their passion and their joy around God, their passion around the Scripture, their love for Jesus, just the peace and the joy that they see. And he's like, I don't know what these people are doing. I don't get it. What do they have that I don't have? And he talks about this experience, and he said, and me thought they spoke as if joy did make them speak. They speak with such pleasantness of scripture language and such appearance of grace, and all they said that they were to me as if they had found a new world. You know, he's like, what is going on? I'm very religious. He felt this, that they had such inner peace, and it's something that he craved, but he didn't have it, and he had these fears, this burden of sin that he wasn't pleasing God. Well, this is the picture of Christian when he first leaves the city of destruction, and he has this burden on his back. Well, that's what John had. He's sitting there, and in his own life, he's got this burden on his back. He thinks himself as being religious. He has the book in his hand, but he doesn't have peace. And we're going to learn in the Pilgrim's Progress that he has to go through the wicket gate. He has to go through some trials before he gets to the cross and the sepulchre, and his burden is lifted. Now, John had an occasion to meet these ladies again. And it turned out that they were a member of a new congregation that met in Bedford, which was a village right next to his village, in a church called St. John's. And this was an independent group, not the Church of England, okay? Because you got to remember, the Church of England the government controlled all of worship. So they were meeting, again, according to their own counsel, not according to the rule of the king. So just a little background, by law, only official state churches, were allowed to meet. There were restrictions on worship that you had to do it by this certain guideline, the prayer book. Now, the government had issued these prayer books to be used during the worship service. Now, understand this. I mean, it's big. Spontaneous, personal prayer, not allowed in public. Now, honestly, many people did not agree with this, and they chose to be nonconformists, is what they called it. And they would meet in these smaller independent groups where they could practice their religion free of government control. The Puritans are one of these groups. When you take it back to America, these Puritans left England to find a place where they could practice their religion without fear from the government. This is why our nation was built with freedom of religion as part of it, where the government cannot control or interfere or pass laws inhibiting freedom of religion. All right? Vastly different than this understanding of separation of church and state. It's not separation of church and state. It's that the government can't get in the way of religion. All right? So this group that was meeting at St. John's was under the leadership, the spiritual leadership of a guy named John Gifford. Now, interestingly enough, John Gifford, when he died, John Bunyan is in prison and becomes their pastor. More on that later. Now, this John Griffith had been the minister at this church since 1650. When John started to attend this little group, he eventually became a member. And this is key. Listen to this. He became the 19th person to enroll into membership of this church. I'm going to stop for just a second. I think it's very important to understand that numbers, big numbers in a church, aren't what's important. If you give me 20 people that are disciple-making, Bible-believing, covenant-following Christians that are bold to preach the word and go and make disciples, I'll take that over 3,000 people that come to worship on a Sunday and all they do is basically listen to the music and complain. All right? This is what this little group was like. And we'll learn more about it. You know, as time went on, he began to find what he was looking for. He got born again. This burden of sin was lifted from his back, and this inner peace came over him. He started reading the Bible, and this is something that became more and more valuable to him. He says this of this time period in his autobiography, Grace Abound to the Chief Sinners. The scriptures also were wonderful things unto me. I saw that the truth and verity of them were the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Now, in 1655, he was still living in his village, and he was doing this 2-mile trip from Elswa to Bedford, and it was becoming a little too hard for him. So he moved his family to Bedford so he could regularly attend the church. And within a year, unfortunately, of moving to Bedford, John's wife dies. Now, he remains in Bedford. He continues, to attend the small gatherings and studying the scripture. And eventually, he met this young woman named Elizabeth. And in 1659, they were married, later had 3 children. Now, John's passion for the Bible was remarkable, and his knowledge for the Word of God just kept increasing and increasing. And the members of the church, they realized that John had gifts. His gifts of teaching and preaching were very, very useful to the church. And soon he became one of the leaders of the church and an elder. And the way it sort of evolved is these members of the church would go out to minister to the villages of Bedfordshire. And Bedfordshire is sort of like the county, okay? That's sort of like Travis County. And so they would go out into the county to these little villages, Lago, Vista, Point Venture, Jonestown, Cedar Park, all these different communities. They'd go out and they would preach, all right? And from time to time, when John goes with them, he would start to say a few words from the Bible, and then it would become more and more where he began his preaching career really by going out into the communities, all right? Not in the church, but in the communities. And this really laid the foundation for his preaching career. And you have to understand something. They had to do this in secret. All right? Because the law of the land says you cannot preach the gospel unless it's done in a place of worship, in a church controlled by the state. All right? So it would be like if, when we meet again in the church as our little small group, we would have to put, lookouts and scouts at the doors and out in the parking lot to see if anybody was, coming after us and coming to arrest us. That's what they would have to do, because the punishment of basically preaching and teaching the gospel outside of the control of the church was definitely imprisonment, and it could be far worse, could be death, could be beheadings. So John, he's no longer this man plagued by fears and insecurities. He is a bold, bold preacher, all right? And I love this. They called him the tinker preacher. And they talk about how passionate his sermons and his teaching was, and how the word of his teaching spread throughout the county, and people flocked to see him. And what happens when people start flocking to see him, even today this happens, what happens is jealousy, envy starts to happen, and basically officials of the church sponsor, the real church, as the state would call it, are starting to become his bitter enemies. In fact, this is what he says. When I went to preach the word abroad, the doctors and the priests of the country did wide open against me. They came after him. And many of them were envious of his success where they had failed. And as we get on to the story, John's arrested a second time. All right, he's arrested twice. The second time, he's defended by a guy named Harry Dean. And he had to defend John against the attacks of this Dr. T. Smith, who was a professor of Arabic and the keeper of the library, the university library at Cambridge. And this Dr. Smith came upon John when he was preaching in a barn, and basically brought charges against him. And when Mr. Henry Dean defended John in that trial, this is what he said. They were angry at the tinker preacher because he tended to men's souls as well as kettles and pots and pans, and proved himself more skillful at this craft than those who had graduated from the university. Now, there's a story that goes like this, that Bunyan was walking the streets in the village of Cambridge and came upon this university man. And this university man basically was outraged, and he asked John, he said, how dare you preach having not the original scriptures? And Bunyan turns this on him, and he goes, well, wait a second, Mr. Scholar. Do you have the actual scriptures that are written from the apostles and the prophets? and the scholar replies to him, well, no, but we have what we believe is the true and original copy. And Bunyan says to him, well, the English Bible that I have here, I think it's true too. And the guy walks away. Now, this probably led to his second arrest. But, Bunyan continued to preach, and he continued to draw more and more people. And he was alarming the officials out there. And in the autumn of 1660, Bunyan faced really what was going to be the greatest, if not the greatest, one of the greatest tests of his life. He was invited to preach at a village about 12 miles south of Bedford, in this village called Lower Samstill. And, he got the invitation, he agreed to the invitation, and he gets this note before he's about ready to make the journey to preach. And he gets this message. He said, hey, the message says, the authorities in the village, they know you're coming, and we're told that if you came and if you preached, you're going to get arrested. And Bunyan, now this bold preacher of the gospel, he would have none of it. And he sends a note back, and he says that he had the word of God to proclaim, and he would not fear what men would do. And he would come. And he came, and he went and preached. And so when he gets there, and he's getting ready to preach to this small congregation, somebody comes up and reminds us, says, look, John, we fear if you start to preach, you're going to be arrested. Well, what does John do? He stands up and he encourages the little congregation, and he says, what do we have to fear? And sure enough, No sooner had he opened his mouth. Some say he was in the middle of prayer. Some say he was, either reading the scripture or into his message. It doesn't really matter. But it wasn't long after that until the village constable came up and arrested him. Now, the authorities would use any means necessary to break up these unofficial religious gatherings, okay? Because you couldn't do that unless you were part of the church. So John was arrested and sentenced under this law that had not been applied to anybody since the time of Elizabeth I. And it was almost forgotten. It was the Conventicle Act of 1539. And this is the act right here. And it says, under this act, all who refuse to attend public worship in their parish churches shall be subject to fine. Those who resort to conventicle, and that's basically preaching yourself, shall be imprisoned until they make their submission. If at the end of 3 months they refuse to submit, they shall be banished from the realm. And if they return from banishment without permission of the crown, they shall be liable to execution as a felon. Oh, wow. Can you imagine if we did that today? You're fined unless you go to your local church. Anyways, John's brought back to Bedford. He's thrown in county jail where he's awaits trial for over a month. Now, the sad part of this particular story is his wife Elizabeth is expecting a child at that point that he gets arrested. During this arrest, and probably as a reaction to John being arrested and thrown into jail, she suffers a miscarriage and just doubles the sorrow of Bunyan. So our story sort of continues, and John was really never sentenced. If we follow this, in January of 1661, he was taken from that county jail and put into this place down by the river called the Chapel of Herne. Now, in Britain at this time, what they had is these special sort of traveling churches, and they met a couple of times a year. And this court is called the Courtly Assides. And in January, the Assides was taking place, and John was taken before these magistrates. And it's a group of about 5 men on this board. And this group looked really foreboding. I mean, you can imagine it. Now, this picture that I have up here is an illustration from the Pilgrim's Progress. And it's an illustration of the sort of puppet court of the Vanity Fair, the city of Vanity Fair, which Christian is brought into and sentenced by. And what John did is he made a parody of this situation in his life. Now, right now, it's no joking matter. These guys are questioning him, and John's defending himself. Then he's defending himself by using the Bible, and he's winning. So they would basically bring up a charge. He would answer it by the Bible, and they'd go back and forth and back and forth. And finally, they got so sick of it. They got so fed up with losing the argument that they sent him away, back to jail. But before they sent him back to jail, they asked him if he would give up his preaching. And Bunyan boldly, almost like Polycarp, answers, "If you set me free, I will preach again tomorrow." That's how bold Bunyan was. So off away they send him to prison, and he will stay in prison in this little jail cell in his hometown of Bedford for 12 years. From 1660 to 1672, he's in jail. And he talks about this moment. He talks about this moment in his book. "At the session after I was indicted for an upholder and maintainer of unlawful assemblies and conventicles, and for not conforming to the national worship of the Church of England, and after ensuing conference, there with the justices, they taking me plain dealings with them for a confession. So that he saying all that he said, they took as a confession. As they termed it, of an indictment, did sentence me to a perpetual banishment because I refused to conform. So being again delivered up to the jailer's hand, I had home to prison. I was put in prison. And there have laid now complete 12 years, waiting to see what God would suffer these men to do with me. Now, I love this. He goes on to say, in which condition I have continued with much content through grace. This, you can, to me, feel where he is reading the end of the book of Acts when Paul is imprisoned, first in Jerusalem and then in Rome. And when he's in prison, Paul, he writes four epistles, one of them being the epistle to the Philippians. And the epistle to the Philippians talks about, with Paul, how content he is, how joyful he is, how we should rejoice. You can just see where Bunyan is grabbing his reaction from the Bible and from Scripture, because this is how he reacts. He uses Paul as an example for his own situation, and he's in jail far longer than Paul was. Now, again, he was never sentenced. He spent 12 years there, and there are occasions of hope. Now, his wife, Elizabeth, is much younger than he was, and she did a lot to help him, and we're going to talk a lot about that here. And she went one day to the House of the Lords in London, and there's two guys up here that I have pictured. She went to this first guy in red over here, who was Sir Matthew Hale, and this is what she said. She begged him, "My lord, I make bold to come again to your lordship, to know what may be done with my husband." Now, Hale informed her that her husband had been legally convicted, and his conviction was recorded. And unless there was something to undo that, he could not do her any good. Oh, when I hear that, I think of Daniel going to the lion's den, and basically, this idea that once a decree is written in the Purges and the Medes, that it cannot be undone, because once a decree is written, it's done. And you hear that same language here. Now, this other guy, this ugly guy, this guy in black, I call him an ugly guy. He is an ugly guy, and you won't like him. I don't like him. His name's Lord Twisden. Now, he was violently angry at Elizabeth, and he accused her of hiding behind her poverty and told her her husband was a breaker of the peace, whose doctrine, I love this, whose doctrine was of the devil. And he accused Bunyan of running up and down and doing harm. And he said that basically he was making more money as a preacher than he was at his career as a tinkerer. And this guy, this ugly guy, it basically said that if he was not withheld, he would have struck Elizabeth. He's a jerk. There's no other way to put it. He's a jerk. But that's what you get, Now, John's in prison. And while he's in prison, he really couldn't do anything to help his family. Now, one of the things that they did that he could do is he made bootlaces, all right? And these bootlaces were very popular in Bedfordshire. And what they would do is like knitting. He would take very fine cotton threads and knit them together, and then he would sell them out the window of his jail cell. He'd get a couple of pence, and that would sort of help. So his jail cell, was probably, it was street level. You could go out, you got the window to the street. It's pretty, there you go. And he really, though, couldn't rely on this as income because there wasn't that much. So he had to rely for the support of his family from members of his own church. And the thing, these prison cells were not, they were terrible, rat infested, cold, musty, dark. And the way that prison worked at that time is they didn't feed you. The jailer didn't feed you. If you wanted provisions, if you wanted food, your family would have to bring it to you. So there's this story that apparently they lived, his home was very close to where he served his time in jail. And his little blind daughter Mary would walk the distance from his home to the jail where her dad was, where John was, with soup and broth, and that was their life. That was their life. Now, I didn't put this up there, so I'm going to read it to you. This is what he tells us. And you can hear his heartbrokenness. He goes, notwithstanding these helps, I find myself a man and compassion with compassioned with infirmities. The parting with my wife and poor children had often been to me in this place as the pulling of flesh from bones. You hear that, that's what it was like. And not only because I am somewhat too fond of these great mercies, but also that I should have often brought to my mind the many hardships, miseries, and wants that my poor family was like to meet with, should I be taken from them, especially my poor blind child, who laid near my heart than all besides. Oh, the thoughts of the hardships I thought my poor blind one might go under would break my heart to pieces. John thought that he was going to die at any moment because prisoners were being killed. All right, they were being executed. So he's in prison. He doesn't know he's going to be there for 12 years. He wasn't sentenced to a time period. So he's sitting there with the thought process that he's going to die at any moment. All right, and he brings out a couple of scriptures. He says that basically to help me in this temptation, these were my considerations. And he brings out two scriptures, these two scriptures to consider. And they're both from Jeremiah. And it says, one that helped me, leave thy fatherless child, I will preserve them alive, and let thy widow trust in me. And again, the Lord said, verily it shall be well with thy remnant. Verily I will cause the enemy to entreat thee well in the time of evil, in the time of affliction. So he's using these scriptures to say that let your family be taken care of by God, and understand that your enemies in this affliction will help you during this time of evil. And that's what happened. John had the opportunity to start writing what was in his mind. And we assume an opportunity to write these things were there. And he would spend hours, as much, if not as much time doing, when these rats are running around the cage, and thinking through this journey, this pilgrimage. And it was a very filthy place. And think about it, that he began to write the story of a man with a sorrowful heart, a man who felt compelled to leave his loved ones and possessions to embark on a journey in this search of a celestial city. You see, John's sitting in jail, and he's having to leave his family because he thinks he's going to die, and this becomes the journey, and this becomes the Pilgrim's Progress. And the man in this journey that John writes about is aptly called Christian. And as many a true Christian on this journey of life, he meets with these temptations, these obstacles, these dangers, but he also meets with supporters who encourage him along the way. You see how John's life and Pilgrim's Progress are going to be tied together? Now, he would spend a lot of time in prison reading his Bible, reading it, and rereading it. And he started to write a lot of books, not just the Pilgrim's Progress, while he was there. He became a prolific writer in prison. And there were other prisoners locked up around him. And these other prisoners were like him in the way that they were basically put in jail for their convictions. And he would talk to them. And these prisoners did not have the same theology that he had. And we're told of the story that there was a Quaker that was with him. And the Quakers have a very different philosophy, theology, as the Reformers or the Puritans that John would be. And he would debate, he would discuss, he would argue with them. And eventually, this led to John writing his first thesis that was going to the leader of the Quaker Church, which is George Fox at the time. And this pamphlet that he wrote was to show the Quakers how wrong they were in their thought process and how this salvation thing all worked. That pamphlet is what I posted on Facebook. This idea of, this map of to salvation, or this map to damnation. So John is really starting to write. He's reading his Bible. This Pilgrim's Progress is starting to formulate in his mind, and something strange happens. Through this life in prison, he was from time to time able to go out. And this happened because basically the jailer saw John and liked John and became converted by John. And the jailer would let John continue his ministry because he became the pastor, John, of the church when the other John Griffith, died. And so church members would come to him, and if there'd be problems, the jailer would let him go out and meet and solve that problem and then come back to the jail cell. And so there's this story of when the jailer let John go out to meet with his parishioners, and he was gone almost the whole day. And John was out, and he felt this burden of, I got to get back to my jail cell. So he left and he went back to his jail cell. And if you can imagine, he's walking up to the door, his jail cell door is open, and he walks in, he sits down, he shuts the jail cell. And what happens is, not long after that, the jailer's walking an official through the jail. And now the jailer is worried because he knows that he has let John go out for the day, and he's going to come upon his jail cell and it's going to be empty, and the official's going to get a little upset with him. But what happens is he comes and John's there sitting in his cell. And the official, sees John and continues his visit, and he leaves. And the jailer is always thankful, profusely thankful for John for coming back. And it's this idea of this providence, this listening to God that just comes throughout John's life. And eventually, after 12 years, in 1672, King Charles II basically suspended all these laws against the nonconformist, and Bunyan was released from prison. He'd been there for 12 years. Now he's released, and he's continuing to be the pastor of his flock. They're meeting in a barn that belongs to one of their members. And by now, he's become well known for his writings and also well known for his preaching. And it's a wonderful time. It's a wonderful time for John. It's a wonderful time for his family. But it's short-lived, because in March of 1675, just a short 3 years later, we get this second warrant of his arrest. And so he's put back into jail. Thankfully, thank God, he's only in prison for about 6 months. But he continues his writing. And when he gets out of that prison, not long afterwards, he has this finished manuscript that he takes to the printers, this manuscript. And when he hands it over to the printers, he goes, I have a manuscript of little worth. That manuscript is the first part of the Pilgrim's Progress, which we will begin to study in detail next week. Now, it became an instant bestseller. Within months, it was an instant bestseller. multiple reprints. Now you jump forward to our founding fathers, and I mean, the Pilgrim's Progress is quoted by many of our founding fathers, in particular George Washington, Ben Franklin. The young Abraham Lincoln, when he was growing up, his parents had 3 books: the Bible, Robinson Crusoe, and the Pilgrim's Progress. That's what Abraham Lincoln wrote about. All right, Mark Twain, in his Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Huck Finn talks about the Pilgrim's Progress. For over 300 years, it's been the number 2 selling book in the world, second only to the Bible. It's been translated into hundreds of languages. And unfortunately, our generation is starting to lose this great story, which is why we're here. We start this journey, which I hope you find just this love of this journey. I know it's in Old English. I know sometimes it's hard to read, but you'll get there. We all get there with it. Because we're going to start this journey with Christian. We're going to start in the city of destruction. We're going to go through into the wicket gate, up to the wicket gate. We're going to go from the interpreter's house to the cross and the sepulcher. We're going to get to the hill of difficulty, the palace of beauty, beautiful. The tower, the terror that's going to happen in the valley of humiliation, the spiritual warfare fight with Apollyon in the valley of the shadow of death. We're going to go to this godless city called the Vanity Fair, to this castle of great despair. And we're going to go on to the Delectable Mountains and finally end our journey in this first part in the city, the celestial city. We're going to meet just really interesting characters: evangelist, Mr. Worldly Wiseman, formalist, hypocrisy, obstinate, pliable, and faithful, and hopeful, and many more. And this journey, really, we're going to look at it in a couple of different ways. And I want you to really, hopefully, embrace this. We're going to look at it through the eyes, this journey through the eyes of Bunyan. So we're going to get a lot more of Bunyan's life intermixed into this journey. Probably more importantly, is we're going to look at this journey through the eyes of Scripture, because there is so much Scripture throughout this journey. And you see it, some of these scriptures in the notes, but we're going to pull out even more. The Bible, the Word of God, is just right in the middle of this allegory. But probably most importantly, and what I hope you get a passion for, is we're going to look at this journey on how it relates to our journey from this world to that which is to come. And here's the thing that excites me as we start this journey more than anything else, is somewhere along this journey, somewhere through this Pilgrim's Progress, we're going to be able to meet again, together, face to face, in the same room. That at least is our anticipated hope. And so as we begin this journey, right now it's virtual. It's me talking to a cell phone and you hopefully, listening while you're doing other stuff. But eventually we will be together and end this journey together along this pathway, along this pilgrim's journey, along the progress of this way. So I hope you enjoy this. It's great. I'm already having a lot of fun rereading this for I don't know how many times and just digging into it in a different way. So that's it for this introduction. Love you guys. Can't wait to see you again. Please put comments. Tell me at least that you're there. And we will see you very, very soon.